Now that we've got the basics of what goes into an introduction down, let's look at how do I make my introduction more specific or more focused towards my essay and what I am asserting, the evidence that I'm using in my essay. So I want to just quickly go back through the basics of the introduction, and then we're going to look at how do I angle my introduction? How do I take the pieces of the story or the pieces of the contextual pieces that will matter most to what I want to assert in my thesis statement and put them into my introduction to make this the strongest impression on my audience. So remember, my introduction is the first impression that the audience will have, and I want to make sure it's a good one. So just as a reminder, the form of the and content of the introduction depends on a lot of factors. So we're thinking about a specific prompt, and we want to make sure that we think about our intended audience, and then we want to think about the fact that this is a literary analysis piece. And so I want to focus this on aspects of the literature that are important to my assertion. Remember, my introduction has to reflect the prompt or the question that I was asked to answer. It has to provide essential context for my topic. Any key terms that I might need that the audience might not be aware of, the reader might not be sure of, I should define it in my introduction. And then your introduction, the last statement of your introduction is always your thesis statement. So you want to make sure you're building towards that big claim that you're going to make at the end, that final sentence of your introduction. So I always put my thesis statement front and center as I try to write my introduction and think about what's important. So here you've seen me outline a thesis statement. This is from one of our Gatsby social commentary papers. We looked at Gatsby earlier in the year, and we talked about how Gatsby is really written, Fitzgerald's really writing this as a criticism of his society. So we wanted to look at and prove one of those social criticisms that we felt Fitzgerald was making. So in this case, the author of this particular paper's original thesis statement is Fitzgerald uses Gatsby's inability to gain Daisy's love to comment on the permanent barrier between classes, revealing that the American dream is unattainable. So this author puts this idea of moving from one social class to another as part of the American dream. So then I want to think about, okay, so what do I want to say before my thesis statements that's going to give my reader an understanding of what it is here about class and American dream that I think is important. So I look down and I think about my opening statement. So one of the assertions I'm trying to make here is that within Gatsby, Fitzgerald is exploring this idea of social hierarchies and class barriers that exist in the early 20th century. So that's my opening sentence. I try to avoid empty sentences or empty fillers and big generalities like marriage has always been about love, or Fitzgerald's Gatsby is a momentous piece of literature of the 20th century. I don't really think they add value, and sometimes those big broad sweeping statements, they're very difficult to connect to the contextual information that I need to provide my reader. So I move on and I think about, okay, the second part of my introduction has to be that transition, and the transition sentences are really geared to providing the reader with the information that is essential for them to understand, or that is essential to build to my thesis statement. So in this case, as I looked at the idea of Gatsby not being able to attain Daisy's love, and I looked at the evidence that I used as far as permanent class barriers and the lack of attainability of the American dream. what I noticed was many of the quotes that were used were from Nick's perspective. So then I felt that it was important to clarify who Nick was and how he was involved and how his perspective may inform my thesis. So then it's Nick is a young Midwesterner who moves to New York to seek his fortune. He's very impressed with the wealth of the people that live on East and West Egg. He's impressed with Gatsby's house initially, and with Gatsby himself throughout. And he's very enamored of Daisy and Tom Buchanan and their wealth and their big colonial mansion on East Egg. He particularly befriends Gatsby, and he begins to understand throughout the course of the novel that Gatsby's not just content with his wealth. Gatsby really wants Daisy, and Nick is the one who introduces him to Daisy. And then it's about how he understands that Gatsby measures his success by whether or not he will be able to gain Daisy. So those are the things within the text that I felt were important enough to put in my introduction. So now, after I've written those things down, I begin to try to frame my introduction and I rework the wording. So now it's F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby examines the condition of social dynamics in the 1920s. Because I talk about class in my thesis statement, I don't want to put class and hierarchies in my opening sentence. That would be slightly repetitive. So I've changed the language here to social dynamics. Fitzgerald achieves this by crafting a story chronicled by Nick Carraway, a young Midwesterner who moves to New York in hopes of finding fortune. He becomes immersed in a group of characters attempting to live out the American dream of limitless opportunity for social mobility, but who are ultimately unsuccessful. This failure is most clear in the character of Jay Gatsby, a fabulously wealthy but criminal businessman who fabricates his entire identity in the hopes of joining the upper-class old money. Gatsby's dream of high status is clearly seen through his courtship of Daisy, the alluring epitome of high society, who is already married to the dauntingly superior Tom Buchanan. Fitzgerald uses Gatsby's inability to elevate his social standing to comment on the permanent barriers between classes, revealing that the American dream is unattainable for all but a select few. So you should notice, as I've read through this, that I clearly followed this brief outline of facts or ideas that I had as far as what I needed to use from the story to build to my thesis statement. You'll also notice that my final thesis, Fitzgerald uses Gatsby's inability to elevate his social standing, is slightly different from my original thesis, which sits all the way up here, where it's Gatsby's inability to gain Daisy's love to comment on. So I rework this to remove Daisy's name from my thesis statement. Instead, I put the idea of Daisy as part of my transition, as part of my contextual information, because I also wanted to bring in this idea that Tom is also somebody who makes sure that Gatsby is not able to elevate into that higher social status or social standing. Now, just quickly, I want to make sure that I can look at the exact same idea, this idea of social mobility, but there was a second piece of writing that approached it from a different way. The textual evidence that the second author had more to do with the setting of the story and dealt a lot with Gatsby versus Tom's mansion and the displays of wealth. And so when I look at that idea about how the classes are separated and one cannot shift from the one class to the other, the nouveau riche cannot break into that old aristocracy, then the facts lend themselves to a little bit of a different contextual angle. So again, this is an angled introduction. So when I think about the setting and those types of things, The second author looked at the stock market boom and the belief that everybody could be a success. Gatsby believes that money can buy its way to the top. Gatsby believes that money can buy Daisy. And then Tom reveals Gatsby's illegal activities, which Daisy rejects and turns away. So again, same initial starting point, which is that idea of social hierarchy and social classes. Very different introduction. So this starts set amidst the world of Long Island's rich and famous. The Great Gatsby explores social hierarchies or classes during the 1920s. Characterized by its booming stock market economy, the 20s championed the idea that any man could reach society's top tier through the accumulation of wealth. The novel's main character, Jay Gatsby, is a member of this rising group of nouveau riche. However, despite obtaining immense wealth, Gatsby is unable to penetrate the ranks of the upper-class elite. Fitzgerald portrays Gatsby's ineptitude through his ostentatious displays of wealth, as well as his inability to win the embodiment of social status, Daisy Buchanan. Fitzgerald's Gatsby exposes the limited mobility within the social hierarchy of the 1920s and asserts the unattainability of the American dream. Notice again the similarity between the two thesis statements. The difference is truly the evidence that is collected. So when you write your introduction, the first thing you want to look at, besides your thesis statement, is the evidence that you've collected, and think about what parts of the stories, what pieces of information does my reader need to have to truly be able to understand and evaluate my evidence. Hope this helps.